did the build of the plasma rifle, I did it in cast aluminium, and the practicality behind it is that if I'm going to have one for the Terminator itself, it's just quite simply too heavy. So I've still got the leftover pattern pieces that I've actually used to actually produce the aluminium version in the first place, and they're only made from foam. So I'm actually going to do a bit of a build here and put these together as a finished rifle, so that the Terminator actually has something to hang on to. So I need to put the parts together, but the surface is very uneven, and things like super glue and things like that will actually melt the surface of the foam. So I'm just going to use a common old silicone to actually bring those two halves together and basically get it all together in one piece. So that's the basic parts of the gun put together now. I've just inserted a piece of aluminium tube there for the lower barrel to give you an idea. The barrel on the top, however, needs to be a little bit thicker, or a bit rounder, and I've got the PVC conduit that I'm actually going to be using there, and you can notice I've actually put a split down the centre of it and taken out a small slice. I'm going to use my heat gun to actually warm that up so that when it's closed it holds that position. And some of you might remember this sort of technique from a previous video where I made up the skeleton arm and the bony bits of the spine and everything else for the base. So it's just a matter of heating it up so it becomes rubbery, and then cooling it to let it snap back into shape. Okay, once that's done, it's quite rubbery, it's also quite hot, so I've got to get it roughly into the shape that's roughly circular. It doesn't have to be perfect for this particular moment. Once I've got that done, I can heat it up a little bit more to actually get the final shape sorted out. That's it, all glued together and ready to be attached. I've actually given that a bit of a sanding over so that it accepts the paint a little better. The other stuff that I'm going to be working with on this build is some of this sheet styrene. It's quite good for construction in its own right. It does have some interesting properties. This stuff does actually have a grain of sorts. You can't really tell it just by looking at it, but there is one particular instance where it will actually bend like that. And if you go against the grain, so that's not against the grain. If you go against the grain, it will snap. So one way, if you like, is bendable. The other way won't be. So that becomes relevant that if I wanted to cut a really thin strip, I want to cut with the grain, because you'll find that a thin strip of it being cut against the grain will have a tendency to snap. It'll curl off and snap. Whereas if you cut with the grain, you can get very thin strips and still maintain the strength in the material itself. You can get around the breakage factor a little bit by scoring the surface. So if you use like a flat blade screwdriver or something like that and draw across the surface like that, you can find that that will actually give you a point where it'll actually bend a bit more, but you'll see there on the spine of that there, it still actually does break a little bit. Whereas if I go the other way, where the grain's more flexible, I can bend that, okay, and be quite aggressive with it, and you see I don't get that splitting in the edge of it like it does on the other piece there. So it's worth knowing which way that grain runs, so that if you do have to make folds in the stuff, it's going to work with you rather than against you. The other thing that's quite interesting about this stuff is that it actually maintains detail that can actually be pushed directly into the styrene surface. You can see the texture in the jaws of the pliers there. Even just squeezing that, you can get some pretty convincing sort of details, and that allows for a lot of other things as well. So to give you an idea, I've got a piece of tube that I've actually just sharpened a little bit on my sander, and I can just give that a pretty good stab, and that can be a line detail in itself. So if I come over to my regular tools, I've got a Phillips head screwdriver there, for instance. I'll just come into the centre of that, and I'm doing this pretty quickly. It could take a bit more time, but that gives you a pretty good, pretty convincing, depending on the other nuts and bolts and stuff you've got. You can see there's some examples I've done there. I've been able to create that one there with a socket tool. That's just a regular Allen key. You can see the Phillips head one there, and then that's another example of possibly a flathead screw. So that is detail that will push directly into the actual styrene surface, and you can get some pretty convincing sort of details. I've used the styrene sheet board stuff to actually make up the gun sight type pieces, and a couple of the sort of detail pieces pretty much ready for starting on the painting process. There's just a quick coat of black paint that I'm using as a base. You can see it looks a bit glossy at the moment because it's still wet, but it's actually a matte black. I'll let that dry, and then I can actually start working out the detail effect and weathering paints.